lecture in our series, The Middle East on the Move, Forwards or Backwards. So good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you listen to this lecture. In the first three lectures, we were building a foundation of understanding the dynamics of the Middle East, its modern history, and the key state actors regionally and globally who are the main stakeholders and who will shape the future direction of the Middle East. Today's lecture begins a series of much deeper review and analysis of the main protagonists in the region: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. We will review in some detail the social, economic, cultural, and political environments in these states, which will serve us well to understand both the domestic and international challenges and opportunities faced by the ruling regimes, and thus be able to apply relevant context to their future foreign and domestic policies, as well as to assess the potential consequences of such policies on the current state of affairs and future direction of the Middle East. There is much more to know and learn about Iran that we could do in one lecture. So our focus today will remain on the key aspects that are the contextual building blocks to better understanding Iran's policies, actions, and reactions to current and future events. And they are the governance structure of the Islamic Republic, the differences between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, Iran's military strategy of deploying proxies in neighboring states, the said state of Iranian's economy due to the sanctions, and of course, Iran's nuclear ambitions. And finally, the potential for yet another populist uprising in Iran. The geographical and topographical significance of Iran in the region is clearly illustrated in this map. It shows the strategic positioning of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its control of the strategic waterways of the Persian Gulf, a gateway to connecting the Asian, African, and European continents. Remember the three words that so characterize the Middle East as a whole, and particularly Iran: oil, waterways, and religion, Shia versus Sunni Islam. In the prior lecture, we reviewed the modern history of Iran that is characterized by its relationship with the United States and its policies. From a social and cultural point of view, Iran has undergone likely the most dramatic transformation from an advanced, educated, economically thriving nation embracing Western culture and traditions, albeit under a dictatorial Shah, to an Islamic republic governed by religious clerics, mullahs, and headed by a supreme leader in likely just as dictatorial a manner. Let's look at what life was like before and then after the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and how this became that.
40 years ago, Shiite Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini spearheaded a revolution that deposed the monarchy in Iran. In its place arose an Islamic republic. A repressive theocracy had replaced an authoritarian monarchy. And almost overnight, Iran had been transformed from a crucial US ally into a bitter opponent. Here are some of the key dates that led to the revolution. From 1941 to 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a close partner of the United States, had ruled Iran. He modernized Iran while forcefully suppressing dissent and political freedoms. The clergy opposed the Shah's social and economic reforms. Discontent grew until in 1978, anti-Shah demonstration spread across the mostly Shia country. Strikes and mass protests erupted, and accusation flew that the Shah was the US puppet. Martial law was imposed. Cassette tapes of speeches by the 76-year-old Khomeini were smuggled into the country, fueling the unrest. Many Iranians took to the rooftops at night to shout Allahu Akbar, or God is great, to express their protest. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran for what was officially a vacation. Many Iranians rejoiced with chants of "The Shah is gone." The man who'd ruled the country for 37 years would never return from exile, dying some 13 months later. On February 1st, a crowd of around 3 million people in Tehran welcomed Khomeini's return from 14 years of exile. Asked about his feelings, the Islamic revivalist famously gave a cryptic one-word answer: nothing. Finally, on February 11th, the revolutionaries declared victory after Iran's demoralized armed forces declared neutrality. The monarchy was suddenly gone. Deadly factionalism followed, but Khomeini held the upper hand. And in April, following a nationwide referendum, an Islamic republic was officially proclaimed, eventually with Khomeini at its apex. Thousands of Shah-era officials and other Iranians would be executed following summary trials. Student revolutionaries would storm the US embassy, taking dozens hostage. Tehran would doggedly pursue anti-Western policies for decades to come. The revolution's 40th anniversary arrives at a critical juncture for the Islamic Republic, hobbled by US sanctions, infighting, and the frustration of a restless young populace, most of whom were born after the revolution. Some regime insiders have warned recently that the Islamic establishment could collapse. Even one of Khomeini's own grandsons warned there's no guarantee that this system his grandfather created would survive. Despite such speculation, it is clear that the clerical establishment remains firmly in place.
Many nationalities have large diasporas spread across the world in our global village. The Iranian diaspora is in many ways unique. It is a highly educated and advanced society that preceded the 1979 revolution, basking in the glorious Persian legacy. Now an Islamic revolution and its social, civil, and religious restrictions forced millions of middle and upper middle class Iranians to flee the country. Today, Iranian diaspora is estimated to be close to 5 million. The majority, somewhat ironically, live in the United States, and 250,000 or so in Canada, mainly in Toronto and Vancouver. They have, for the most part, integrated famously in the Canadian society, and many are thriving in our country, definitely when compared to other Middle Eastern countries' diasporas. The brain drain continues to plague Iran as it still maintains open borders, and some 150,000 educated people are still leaving Iran every year. To be sure, the influence of the Iranian diaspora extends back to the country, if through family connections or business interest. And as such, it represents a threat to the mullahs, who are paranoid by the threat from external forces potentially motivated by Iranian diaspora to topple the regime. The following timeline represents the recent history of Iran's regime changes, from a liberal democracy to a US-backed Shah-led dictatorship to the Islamic Republic of today. As mentioned before, Iran governance structure is likely unique in the world. It is ruled by a supreme leader who controls the judiciary, the security apparatus, and a military arm known as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, in addition to the country's standing army. You will discover by watching the following video that best explains the complex and convoluted governance structure, which also includes a pseudo-democratically elected parliament and president, a strange combination aimed at reinforcing strict Islamic rule at home and present a so-called democratic face to the outside world to gain international respect. In the summer of 2021, so-called democratic elections were held for the Iranian presidency and parliament, and not surprisingly, the candidate Ebrahim Raisi, a staunch hardliner, and some say a designated successor to the supreme leader Khamenei, was elected.
There's something that might seem confusing about Iran. The country has an unelected supreme leader at the top, but it's also got a president who's democratically elected in votes that are far from perfect, but sure look pretty important. So is Iran a dictatorship or is it a democracy? As it turns out, it's both, and seeing that goes a long way to explaining why the country is the way it is. Iran as we know it today began with a revolution in 1979, which culminated in a simple referendum that March: Islamic Republic, yes or no? But what is an Islamic Republic? How can a country's government be both theocratic and representative? Iran's revolutionary leaders didn't really know the answer either, and they never agreed, so they ended up creating a government that has these two systems mashed together. Some parts are elected, some are unelected, and they're all tangled together in this kind of mess. Now, there's a real tension between those two systems. Iranians elect, more or less democratically, the president, the parliament, which is called the Middleeast, and a really important body called the Assembly of Experts. We'll get to that later. At the same time, there's the unelected theocracy, the supreme leader, the judiciary, the military, and others. Still, the supreme leader really does dominate Iran. He sets the tone for the country's politics and policies, including its nuclear program and its official hostility to the West. But what happens when the supreme leader dies or gets sick? This turns out to be a really important question. The supreme leader is picked by a group of about 90 senior Iranian political and clerical leaders called the Assembly of Experts. But here's where Iran's Islamic Republic system gets important. The Assembly's members are elected in a national vote. This year, on February 26, Iranians will elect an entirely new Assembly of Experts for an 8-year term. Even Ali Khamenei, the current supreme leader, has acknowledged that he's likely to die in that time. Iranian politics are really split right now, with moderates rapidly rising after the nuclear deal helped to open up the economy. If they do well in February's election, then when Khamenei dies, they might pick a new supreme leader who shares their views, and that could change Iran as we know it for a generation. Now, this all goes to show that we think of Iran as just another dictatorship, and indeed it does have a dictator at the top, but it's also a democracy. It's got loud political disagreements, vigorous debates over its future. This election in February is a rare moment, once in a generation, when Iran's democratic elements become more powerful than its theocratic elements. Iranians have an opening here to try to transform their country. If they take it, and if they're successful, Iran could look very different for quite a while.
Established in the wake of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the Revolutionary Guards are often described as a parallel government within Iran. The IRGC controls much of the country's economy and wields more power and influence than the army itself. Tasked with protecting national interests at home and abroad, it's heavily involved in regional politics and conflicts. Its foreign arm, the elite Quds Force, has been instrumental in military and political successes outside Iran, making the man who headed the organization, the late Qasem Soleimani, a highly regarded figure in the country. Under him, the Quds Force successfully developed local militias to back Iranian interests in the region.
He's responsible essentially for putting together the resistance to the insurgencies in Syria, keeping Assad in power. He's also been behind Hezbollah, and also obviously in creating all these organizations in Iraq. I mean, in many ways, he's been, considering the leadership of Iran, he's the guy who has been the most charismatic, the most visible in terms of successes.
Last year, the United States designated Iran's Revolutionary Guards a terrorist organization, an unprecedented step as it's the first time a government's official military wound up on the list. Washington says it ordered Qasem Soleimani's killing as he was plotting imminent attacks on Americans in the Middle East. Claims Tehran vehemently denies. Soleimani's replacement, meanwhile, has vowed his death won't be in vain.
We promise to continue down Martyr Soleimani's path as firmly as before, with the help of God, and in return for his martyrdom, we aim to get rid of America from the region in several steps.
Iran says Qasem Soleimani was targeted numerous times in the past. The man who contributed to Tehran's growing influence in the region died on foreign soil, where most of his battles were fought.
Iran is the self-declared leader with the largest population of the Shia branch of Islam. Its arch rivals are the Jewish state of Israel and the Sunni Islam spiritual leader Saudi Arabia. On the surface, you may think that this lends itself to religious wars, but it's not. It is paramount to understand the religious divide in the Islamic world, but at the same time to understand that the combative nature of the conflict is not religious in nature, but rather political power driven, as you will discover by watching the next video.
The terms Sunnis and Shiites get thrown around a lot when discussing Middle Eastern conflicts. And sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. But with over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there's no way they can all be involved in some Hatfields and McCoy-style blood feud. So what's really going on here? Well, first of all, not all Sunnis and Shiites are at war with each other. There are tons of places where they coexist peacefully, like the United Arab Emirates, or Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's also worth noting that their religions aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, the Sunni-Shiite conflict isn't even really about religion, it's about power. Originally, Muslims were all one group, unified under the Prophet Muhammad. Then, in the year 632, Muhammad died, and Muslims split off into two separate groups. The Sunnis wanted Muhammad's successor to be chosen by his community of followers, while the Shiites wanted the leadership to stay within the Prophet's family. The Sunnis were in the majority, so they chose their new leader to be the Caliph, which is basically the head of state. The Shiites did not recognize this new leader, and instead, they chose Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, as their new imam, which also basically means head of state. That was the main source of divide, and from there, things really only got worse. Early on, most of the Shiite imams met violent ends at the hands of the stronger Sunni caliphs, including Imam Ali's son, Hussein, whose beheading is still considered a major holiday for Shiite Muslims. Today, there are numerous Sunni and Shiite militant groups, terrorist organizations, and oppressive governments. Being Sunni or Shiite doesn't necessarily make you a member or even a supporter of those groups, but they're still divided up that way. In fact, every nation with Sunni-Shiite conflicts has large militant groups on both sides, and they all have a history of oppressing one another depending on who's currently in power. Iraq, for example, was run by an oppressive Shiite regime before Saddam, then an oppressive Sunni regime under Saddam, followed by an oppressive Shiite regime once again after Saddam left power. Now the oppressive Sunni militant group ISIS is threatening to take over huge parts of the country. So you can see that the Sunni-Shiite conflicts are more about power, politics, and retribution than actual religion. And truthfully, the words Sunni and Shiite aren't even the best words to use when discussing Sunni-Shiite conflicts. They are way too general. If you're talking about militant jihadists or terrorist networks, but what you really mean is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, just say ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, you're including billions of people who aren't even involved and most likely don't share the beliefs of those fringe organizations. If you'd like to learn more interesting information about the world, click now to see our video about the lethal injection debate and why it should matter to all of us. And remember, we'll be putting out new episodes 5 days a week, so click now to keep watching and please subscribe.
The power struggle for Islamic hegemony between Iran and Saudi Arabia has been and continues to be the source of conflict and civil wars that is played out as we speak, for instance, between the Alawite, a Shia sect regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and the civil war between the Houthis, a Shia-affiliated sect backed by Iran in Yemen, and the Sunni government backed by Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia and Iran have been waging proxy wars for regional dominance for decades. This rivalry has dragged the region into chaos and ignited Sunni-Shia conflict across the Middle East. Animosity between the two countries have been sharpened by a series of events, from the war in Syria and Yemen to the trial of strength in Iraq and Lebanon. But were Iran and Saudi Arabia always enemies? Before 1979, Iran and Saudi Arabia shared good diplomatic ties, as both countries were governed by Western-backed monarchs. This is the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, visiting Saudi Arabia in 1978. Months later, everything changed. The root of the conflict lies in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which saw the pro-Western monarch Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi toppled and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini.
There was a triumphant and tumultuous welcome in Tehran today by more than 1 million Iranians for the Ayatollah Khomeini, returning home from 15 years of exile.
The return of Khomeini marked a turning point in the Saudi-Iranian relationship. The Saudi regime, the self-proclaimed leader of the Sunni world, was alarmed by the presence of an Islamic revolution in the region. Khomeini openly opposed the idea of a monarchy as un-Islamic, drawing parallels between the Saudi monarch and the Shah of Iran. He was also hostile towards Western-backed governments, particularly those backed by the US, which is an important ally for the Saudis. In 1980, a CIA report revealed that Iran was attempting to export the Islamic Revolution to neighboring countries. The fear of the spread of the Iranian Revolution triggered a series of events. In Qatif, home to Saudi Arabia's Shia majority, protesters took to the streets calling for reform while raising pictures of Khomeini. The protests led to a violent crackdown by security forces, killing at least 20 people and arresting hundreds. The GCC was created as an alliance between 6 Gulf monarchies. It was a unified regional political and security front against the perceived Iranian threat. 2 years into the Iran-Iraq war, Saudi Arabia decided to provide military and financial support to Saddam Hussein, in a move that further escalated tensions between Tehran and Riyadh. The Iraqi president had invaded Iran over fears the country's Shia majority would be influenced by Khomeini's revolution. Mecca became a site of unprecedented violence when Iranian pilgrims held anti-US demonstrations. This led to clashes with Saudi security forces, resulting in a stampede that killed at least 400 people. Following the events in Mecca, Saudi Arabia suspended its relations with Iran for 3 years. Over the next few decades, relations between the two countries had its share of ups and downs. But the 2011 Arab Spring changed the geopolitical dynamics, with a fight for dominance in the Middle East reaching a new level. During the Arab Spring, both countries supported opposing sides in regional conflicts. Iran openly spoke in support of the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt and Bahrain, countries that were run by Sunni dictators who shared favorable relations with Saudis. The two powerhouses were also on opposing sides when the revolution reached Syria. But this time, Saudi Arabia backed the opposition and Iran allied with the regime. Syria's Bashar al-Assad was always an important ally for Iran. He's from a minority Shia sect and rules over a majority Sunni state. So Iran wants to keep the Syrian regime in power at all costs. Since 2011, it has been supporting the Syrian regime with weapons, ground troops and training. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, continues to back the rebels and military defectors. 7 years later, the proxy war has had devastating effects on civilians, with 6 million Syrians displaced, 5 million refugees and more than 500,000 killed. Saudi Arabia's attempt to curb Iran's influence in Syria has failed so far, as the regime still controls most of the country. Then there is Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition is engaged in a bitter fight against Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, who are Shias. This has drawn the country towards the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of people have been killed since the start of the conflict, and more than 22 million Yemenis are in need of humanitarian assistance. While Iran supplies the Houthi rebels with weapons, Saudi Arabia has intervened direct with military action. They have launched more than 18,000 airstrikes and an imposed blockade, stopping critical aid from getting into the north of the country. While the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia has adopted its most aggressive stance in Yemen, other countries have not been spared. In Iraq, Lebanon and Bahrain, the countries are playing a critical role by supporting governments and political players along sectarian lines. Although Iran and Saudi Arabia have never engaged in a direct confrontation, their proxy battle in the Middle East continues to escalate, further dividing the region. But can it be stopped?
Critical to understanding Iran's foreign policy is its tumultuous relationship and, mildly put, animosity between Iran and the United States, beginning with the CIA coup to topple a democratic government in 1951, to installing what some say a puppet dictator to do its bidding, especially as it relates to Iran's primary asset, oil, and of course to the Islamic Revolution and the infamous U.S. hostage-taking at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
For over 40 years, Iran has stood in profound opposition to the United States. And many of the US's moves throughout the Middle East have a lot to do with Iran, one way or another. Here are some key moments in the long history of US-Iran tensions. 1953, Iran's then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh is overthrown in a CIA-backed coup after his efforts to nationalize the country's oil industry. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the US-favored Shah of Iran, comes to power. The US supports the Shah with hundreds of millions of dollars of military and economic aid over the next quarter century. 1979, the Iranian Revolution deposes the Shah. Returning from exile, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini seizes power and famously calls the US the Great Satan. That same year, members of a revolutionary group storm and occupy the US Embassy and take 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days.
American citizens, soldiers, and diplomats, bound, blindfolded, paraded before the world. Images of humiliation and helplessness sear their way into the hearts and minds of America.
On April 7, 1980, both countries sever diplomatic relations. American confidence falls. That same year, an 8-year-long war between Iraq and Iran breaks out, in which almost 1.5 million people are killed. The US backs Iraq, giving several $1 billion worth of economic aid, military intelligence, and training. In 1983, a suicide bomber targets a US Marine barracks in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, killing 241 US military personnel. The Iranian-backed Hezbollah is blamed for the bombing and a separate attack on the US Embassy in Lebanon. 1 year later, the Reagan administration lists Iran as a state sponsor of terror. 1988, the Iranian airbus is shot down. An American warship shoots down an Iranian passenger airline, killing all 290 people on board, including 66 children, following some skirmishes between a US ship and Iranian vessels in the Persian Gulf. The US claims it was an accident. The Iranians aren't convinced. 1990s, Iran is accused of supporting a number of Hamas and Hezbollah attacks in the region. 1995, President Bill Clinton places wide-ranging oil and trade sanctions on Iran. 1997, Iran elects the reformist Mohammad Khatami as president, who later calls on both countries to bring down the wall of mistrust in a CNN interview. The US scales back some sanctions. In 2002, relations sour again as President George W. Bush describes Iran, along with North Korea and Iraq, as an axis of evil, and accuses Iran of engaging in a secret nuclear weapons program. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad becomes the Iranian president, and his harsh rhetoric sets the tone for the upcoming years.
چه کسانی به بهانه حادثه مشکوک 11 سپتامبر و در واقع برای سلطه بر خاورمیانه و نفت آن افغانستان و عراق را اشغال کردند و میلیون‌ها نفر کشته و مجروح و آواره بر جای گذاشتند.
2006 to 2010, the US succeeds in getting 4 rounds of UN sanctions passed against Iran. They demand that Tehran stop enriching uranium and exporting weapons, and are pressured with some banking, trade and travel restrictions. 2013, Hassan Rouhani assumes the Iranian presidency. A phone call with then-President Barack Obama on a trip to a UN forum in New York becomes the first conversation between US and Iranian heads of state in 30 years. 2015, Iran and international powers, the US, Britain, China, France, Germany, Russia and the European Union finally sign an agreement called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In the deal, Iran agrees to heavily restrict its nuclear program in return for significant easing of US, UN and EU sanctions. On January 16, 2016, all nuclear-related sanctions on Iran are lifted in response to fulfilling the key conditions of the agreement. Iran's strategy in the region, siding with the Assad regime, has worked. Iran has well-established influence in Syria, and in the wake of the American withdrawal from Iraq, the country has strengthened its connections in Iraq. 2017, with Trump's presidency, things get heated again. Travel bans, missile tests, sanctions, and insults follow one after another. And now the future of the key nuclear deal is at serious risk. Trump threatens to scrap it if the terrible flaws aren't fixed, although Europe begs the US to keep the deal. And the world will learn the fate of the deal on May 12th.
But of course, the main target of Iranian aggression is the State of Israel. Why? It is simply the easiest target in the region, as it is the only non-Islamic state, and of course, its affiliation with the United States. The rhetoric, as you can see, has been extreme, which legitimizes Israel's retaliatory and disruptive clandestine activities targeting the Iran nuclear program. But historically, and in typical Middle East irony, the relationship between Israel and Iran that preceded the Islamic Revolution was not only amicable, but highly cooperative, as you will learn in the next video.
Once allies, now arch rivals, the turbulent journey of Israel and Iran from friendship to nemesis.
In front of us stands one central factor: Iran and its terrorist proxies. If we get united against the Zionists and America, we will definitely be victorious. We had to pierce Iran's lies. It lies all the time.
The United States, the evil Britain, and the damned and cancerous Zionist regime. These are the main enemies.
This mutual hostility is the current state of affairs, but it wasn't always like that. Far from it. While not supporting the 1947 partition plan, Iran was one of the first countries to recognize Israel de facto in 1950. The periphery strategy of Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, heavily relied on Iran. The plan sought to strengthen Israel's relations with the non-Arab countries in the region, from Turkey to Ethiopia to Iran, and indeed, for several decades, Israeli connections with Tehran were strong and very warm. Official state visits, oil deals, regular flight routes, security ties, it all happened. But then came the revolution that changed it all.
We went out of the house and started walking straight up the street. We reached a corner, and at that corner, 10 people joined us. The streets were completely empty. I told my friend, this looks strange, and I think we're going to end up in the middle of a protest, and that's exactly what happened. These weren't religious people. These were students that yelled Allahu Akbar, true, and yelled death to the Shah, but they also yelled freedom and democracy. Their idea wasn't religious at all. It was an idea of a revolution for freedom.
From the moment the Ayatollahs took over, nothing was the same. No more ties, no more cooperation. Yes to fundamental hatred. Yes to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Yes to Holocaust denial.
The West and the colonialists, in order to dominate the world, created an idol called the Zionist regime. The spirit of this idol was a story called the Holocaust. The Iranian nation, with courage and wisdom, smashed this idol to free the people of the West.
On the Iranian side, it wasn't just rhetoric, but rather active aggression against Israel, not directly, but through sponsored terror proxies, namely Hezbollah and Hamas. On the Israeli side, most prominently was the fierce battle against Tehran's nuclear ambitions, multiple intelligence operations allegedly, and a worldwide diplomatic campaign.
The Iran deal, the nuclear deal, is based on lies. It's based on Iranian lies and Iranian deception.
But even today, there are those who believe the lost love between Iranian people and Israel could be restored.
Iranians are not against Israelis at all, and to be honest with you, there are so much compassion and support. Today might be the governments has been in a clashes with each other, which they cannot see any ground common attraction, but definitely Iranians were seeing themselves like they are friends with Israelis.
Going from the destructive to the constructive in the roller coaster Middle East, anything is possible. Ellie Hochenberg, I-24 News.
Speaking of Middle East irony and speculating on the trajectory of the Middle East, forward or backward, the threat of a collision between Iran and Israel has become a catalyst to paving the road for peace between Israel and the Sunni Arab states. The sanctions leveled against Iran and the constraints on its export industry, practically only oil, and thus the near collapse nature of their domestic economy, has set Iran to seek partnership relationship with other global powers that ideologically and practically oppose the United States. First among them, Russia, with whom they collaborate in protecting the regime in the Syrian war and receive diplomatic cover in its proxy wars in Yemen and possibly Lebanon. From an economical point of view, Iran is flirting with China, or maybe it is the other way around. China needs Iran oil, and China is one of the few clients that are not bound by the US embargo on Iranian oil exports. Of course, China would like to extend what they may disagree, to my definition, their economic colonialization as part of the Road and Belt and Silk Road initiatives in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And they have already invested some $400 billion in the Iranian economy. As already mentioned, in the summer of 2021, the new president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, was sworn in to replace, after 2 terms, the prior president, considered a moderate, if not a reformist, Hassan Rouhani. Raisi, handpicked by the supreme leader, is known as a hardliner. He was previously head of the country's judiciary and has ultra-conservative political views. Many Iranians and human rights activists have pointed to his alleged role in the mass executions of political prisoners in the 1980s. This is especially an important factor as negotiations between Iran and the world power for re-entry into a nuclear agreement that the Trump administration exited abruptly and unilaterally are taking place right now. Raisi seems to be taking an especially hard line, as has been expected, with demands that the Biden administration may not be able to readily accept. Now we come to the crux of the matter. The risk of Iran affiliating with Russia and China in opposition to the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Sunni Arab world is understandable, but not as material as the resolution, or lack thereof, of the nuclear agreement talks that are taking place in Vienna at the beginning of 2022. The real threat to the region, which may set it back into intensified conflicts, if not outright wars, is that of Iran becoming a nuclear power backed by US nemesis Russia and China. Therefore, it is imperative to understand the background to the 2015 Iranian nuclear agreement, dubbed the JCPOA. So we go back to 2015 to understand the origins of the JCPOA and likely conclude, as did Israel's defense establishment, and the new government of Israel, as well as the US Department of Defense, that the Trump administration made a colossal, if not tragic, foreign policy blunder by unilaterally withdrawing from the existing nuclear agreement of 2015.
In order to understand the Iranian nuclear negotiations, you need to understand the trilateral relationship between the United States, Israel, and Iran. At first blush, it seems very simple. The United States and Israel are allies. They're both opposed to Iran. But the way these negotiations have gone down has severely complicated the matter. To understand why, we need to look at the individual personalities that are involved in the negotiations. First off, and perhaps most importantly, is President Obama. Resolving the Iranian nuclear standoff peacefully is a major foreign policy priority for President Obama. However, it's difficult to resolve given Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is rather hostile to Western interests, specifically the United States. However, while he does have final control over the Iranian government, he can be pushed by factions inside Iran, specifically more moderate ones that are interested in sanctions relief in exchange for a deal. President Hassan Rouhani is widely seen as one of these moderate figures, and his 2013 election suggested to many Americans that Iran and the Supreme Leader might be willing to make a deal. This has infuriated America's ally in Israel. Its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sees the Iranian nuclear program as an existential threat.
We need a better deal, a different deal, because this deal would leave Iran with sufficient capability. 6,000 centrifuges enables them to break out to a bomb very quickly.
This has put Netanyahu at odds with Obama, and in order to deal with this disagreement, he's turned to Republicans in the United States.
I've invited Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to address a joint session of Congress.
That's why this deal is so bad. It doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb. It paves Iran's path to the bomb.
47 Republican senators put their names today to this open letter to Iran.
This type of alliance between a foreign leader and a domestic American opposition is basically unprecedented. So you've got a strange situation where the United States is at loggerheads with its closest ally in the Middle East, where the United States is divided amongst itself on foreign policy, and where you've got President Obama desperately trying to bolster the standing of moderates inside Iran, a country the United States has regarded as a serious enemy since 1979.
A political review and analysis of Iran cannot be completed without understanding Iran's involvement in regional conflicts, and especially the civil wars in Syria and Yemen. Iran is deploying a somewhat unique strategy in the region by sponsoring proxy military militias such as Hezbollah in Syria and the Houthis in Yemen, essentially trained, equipped, and operated under the command of the Quds, an arm of the Islamic Republic Guard, Iranian's military arm, led by the Iranian so-called hero Qasem Soleimani, until his assassination over a year ago by presumably the United States, possibly with the help of Israel.
But what the Iranians have done is not simply defend an ally, but they've created a really powerful expeditionary force driven by and reliant on recruitment of Shia partisans from across South Asia. And this has, I think, become a very powerful tool in their arsenal and is one of the factors that I would argue is going to sustain Iran's involvement in Syria, not simply the commitment to maintaining supply lines and ease of access to Hezbollah, not simply the appreciation of the expansive reach that Iran now has across the region, but the fact that Iran, for the first time in the post-revolutionary history, has engaged, to some extent successfully, in a conflict outside of its borders by relying on the recruitment of a transnational army, an army that can't be sent home, can't be repatriated to Iran for a variety of domestic reasons. And that is quite useful in trying to shift the demographic balance of the future Syrian state. And I think that is a very powerful reason why we're going to see the Iranians sustain their involvement in Syria. They're looking to consolidate their gains, to test the red lines. We've seen already the first use of force by the Israelis against Iranian targets on the ground in Syria, ramping up what has been a long-standing campaign on the part of the Israelis to try to push back against at least Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. This latest development, the attack on Iranian forces, I think, is just a taste of things to come. I have colleagues here from the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brookings who can speak to this in greater depth, but I think we're going to see a continuing process between the Iranians and the Israelis to try to test the boundaries of what might be tolerable. And this is where the position of the United States becomes so interesting. Finally, the Iranians want a kind of payback. They've invested a lot in Syria, not just hundreds of their own Revolutionary Guard commanders, thousands of those that they recruited to fight in Syria from South Asia, from the Shia militias in Iraq and Hezbollah, but also in terms of their own treasury. And these strains, as I said, have been showing up in terms of the domestic politics of Iran. And what we're hearing from the Iranian leadership is that they're determined to stay, that they, in fact, see the fight in Syria as the kind of front lines, as Ayatollah Khamenei said recently, of the fight against the world imperialism and the conspiracy against Iran. There is a heightened risk. The Iranians appreciate that as this new phase of the war begins, with a more assertive Saudi Arabia, with an American president who is more unpredictable than his predecessors, that the possibility of a wider conflict is one that they have to be prepared for, but every indication from Tehran suggests that they are in fact prepared for that fight.
Since 2015, a Saudi-led coalition has been waging a war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, unleashing one of the most severe humanitarian crises in recent history. But who are the Houthis? The Houthis make up around 25% of Yemen's population. Although they belong to the Shia sect of Islam, they are Zaydis. They follow a branch that's different to the Twelver Shia Islam, the dominant practice in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. Zaydis take their name from Zayd ibn Ali, the great-grandson of Ali who was killed in an uprising. Zayd is revered as a leader that fought against a corrupt regime. The Zaydi believe that it is their religious duty to fight against unjust rulers. That contrasts with most Sunni and Shia doctrines that usually encourage unity over disorder. For 1,000 years, Zaydis have lived in the mountains of former northern Yemen in what is present-day Saada province bordering Saudi Arabia. In 1978, Ali Abdullah Saleh, a Zaydi, came to power in former North Yemen. 12 years later, North Yemen and South Yemen were united into one country. Saleh's rule lasted until 2011. In the late 80s, Saudi-funded Salafi institutes were established in the north of Yemen with state support. This made Zaydis feel marginalized. They responded by trying to revive their religion and culture under the leadership of Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, and the Houthi movement was born. But it was the 2003 war in Iraq that made the group more politically active. The Houthis opposed the US-led invasion of Iraq. Hussein al-Houthi began criticizing Saleh, calling him a US-backed dictator. When some Houthis protested in mosques in the capital Sana'a, Saleh tried to crack down on the movement by sending troops to arrest Hussein al-Houthi. This triggered the first armed conflict between the government and the Houthis. Hussein al-Houthi was killed in 2004, and his brother, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, took over. Saudi Arabia backed the government, and despite religious differences, Iran began supporting the Houthis. The Houthi movement accepted Iran's support, but resisted direct interference. For the Iranians, the Houthis being a counterforce to Saudi interests was enough. The Houthis achieved initial military success which provoked more Saudi-backed government force. The parties then reached a ceasefire agreement in 2010. A year later, when the Arab Spring reached Yemen, the Houthis were one of many groups calling for Saleh to step down. And when he did, the Houthis joined a national dialogue. But they were unhappy with the outcome, as it would reduce their territorial autonomy. The new president, Abdurabu Mansur Hadi, also backed by the Saudis, had trouble stabilizing the country. He couldn't stop al-Qaeda attacks, and fuel prices and unemployment began to skyrocket. This provoked a new rebellion. This time the Houthis allied with their once sworn enemy, former President Saleh, who still had military forces loyal to him. By 2015, Houthi rebels had toppled the government and gained control of Yemen's major cities. When they entered Sana'a, they rebranded themselves as Ansar Allah, or the Helpers of God, and opened air traffic between Tehran and Yemen, promising cheap oil. Across the northern border, Saudi Arabia's king Salman bin Abdulaziz ascended the throne and saw the Houthis as a dangerous and an important pawn in the proxy war against Iran. Saudi Arabia formed a coalition with other Arab states backed by the US, UK, and France and began strikes on the Houthis. Despite this, 3 years later, the Houthis still control large parts of the country, and the war has been costly. More than 10,000 people have been killed, and almost 2 million children under the age of 5 are considered acutely malnourished.
Of course, there's no end to complications in the Middle East. And the latest one is, of course, Afghanistan. The Taliban's comeback is a conundrum for Iran. No one in the Iranian government was said to see the United States and NATO troops leave Afghanistan. In fact, Tehran would prefer to have the Taliban next door than often hostile Western powers. But Shia majority Iran has also been a target of attacks in the past from the Sunni Islamist Taliban, and it worries that if Afghanistan descends into chaos, it would negatively affect Iran's ability to extend its influence and trade with its neighbor, or worse, that the volatility could spill over into Iran, both in terms of terrorism, but also in terms of refugees fleeing Afghanistan and flooding Iran, which doesn't have the economy or the desire or the need to have them reside inside Iranian territory. Finally, we need to understand that life in Iran, in the face of the sanctions that crippled the economy and created shortages of basic necessity, is harsh to say the least. It is further compounded by similar recessions in neighboring states of Pakistan and Afghanistan. As a result, there's an unneeded and unwanted flow of refugees, especially from Afghanistan, that only exasperates the economic decline and which has always been harshly quashed by the force of the regime, but continued to be an almost permanent risk to a populist uprising, if not regime change.
Amid waves of the coronavirus pandemic and crippling U.S. sanctions, Iran's economy is shrinking and witnessing losses just weeks before the country is set to resume the nuclear deal talks with 6 world powers. Iran's currency, rial, declined by nearly 2.8% in the past week, bringing the total amount of losses in the last 6 months to 31.5%. The most affected by the inflation are businessmen and traders who are forced to buy foreign currencies and gold for sustenance.
مردم به خاطر اینی که پولشون میبینن داره سقوط میکنه، پول ملی داره میاد پایین، مجبور میشن بیان دلار بخرن و ارزهای خارجی، حالا طلا. الان ما هفته به هفته شاید هم 3 روز داریم تغییر قیمت‌ها رو مشاهده میکنیم و این فردا مشکل واقعا انسجامش واقعا زیاد میشه که خودشون هم دیگه دستشون در بیاره و غیر قابل کنترل میشه در حقیقت.
The slump in economy comes after the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Iran after the American exit from the 2015 nuclear deal. The Iranian currency lost nearly 70% of its value following the double punishment. The currency plunge has forced the central bank to act, pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into the market to stabilize the Iranian currency. Economists say dire actions are needed from the government to avert further crisis.
اگر روند تورمی کشور ما و عدم تغییر روند بهره‌وری ما، عدم چابکی و چالاکی دولت ما رخ ندهد و دارایی ها و صنایع ما به صورت سودآور و مؤثر در اقتصاد ملی ظاهر نشوند، قطعا این روند کاهش ارزش پول ملی و به تبع اون کاهش افزایش نرخ دلار ادامه دار خواهد بود.
A former deputy of Iran's central bank criticized the conditions set by Iran ahead of the nuclear talks. Iran had sought the United States not to withdraw from the 2015 nuclear agreement and lift the sanctions. It is not just Iran. The economies of Pakistan and Turkey have also taken massive hits. These countries, just like Iran, remain on the fate or the FATF grey list for failing to curb terror financing. Calls for Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan to resign have intensified amid the economic crisis and soaring prices. The inflation in Pakistan is the fourth highest in the world. Low productivity and high import dependency has caused the price inflation. The rupee closed at an all-time low at 175.73 rupees compared to the US dollar last week. Pakistan's currency has lost more than 13% of its value since May this year. Unrest and bloodshed in neighboring Afghanistan and uncertainty of its future has also impacted Pakistan's trade with the country. The State Bank of Pakistan's decision to curb imports and purchase of US dollars has also failed to arrest the decline. Saudi Arabia has promised to place safe deposits of nearly $3 billion with the Pakistan State Bank, along with supply of oil worth nearly $1.2 billion for the next year. However, this is expected to be a temporary solution. Meanwhile, Turkey saw massive protests amid the country's budget presentation. The Turkish currency is the worst performer in emerging markets this year, along with a double-digit inflation. As per experts, the condition of the economy is propelled by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's lack of policy credibility.
So the real question is, could there be another revolution in Iran? This time of the young, unemployed, opportunity-deprived, resentful 20 to 35-year-old masses who represents the majority of the Iranian population. By now you should have ample context within which to understand why seemingly contradictory events are driven by Iran to stem internal opposition, economic collapse, while maintaining influence and power across the region, with potential backing from Russia and China, US's main competitors, and continuing to advance its nuclear capabilities that as of this time remain unchecked. Thank you for taking interest in the Middle East on the Move, today focused on Iran. In our next lecture, we move the lens on Saudi Arabia.